Um, Let me just share my screen because I want to bring to your attention a Zidane quote and everyone can see it. Shout out to Ewan McTeer, who was there on site at Estadio Alfredo Di Stefano on behalf of Managing Madrid. That was the first game Managing Madrid has attended since the Clásico last year in March. So this is where we get into Casemiro discussion, gentlemen, because if I'm being really honest with you, by the end of this game, I forgot Casemiro wasn't even playing. So let's get into this very juicy, controversial topic. Zidane said after the game, with Casemiro, we can play in a different kind of way. But Luka and Toni Kroos are phenomenal as a double pivot. Luka may be 35 years of age, but he doesn't look like it on the pitch. So my question to you guys is, and this is obviously on the back of like Casemiro's actually been incredible and he's in his peak right now. This is not really actually meant to be Casemiro slander at all. But I'm just posing the question. And someone else in the chat, I think, posed it at some point during this podcast. Do you guys think that this game in particular, possibly it was a blessing that Casemiro didn't play? This was something that Jose and I talked about on Monday's podcast. Like, if you're playing a team that's going to press you and you want to have a press-resistant game plan, which you didn't have against Ajax and Manchester City, does this actually benefit you in an indirect way? And is this something that you should look to replicate against, we're getting into the quarterfinal stage now. We're talking about the Bayerns, the Cities, the Liverpools, etc. So what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think, like, if we were to play City tomorrow, I would prefer to play without Casemiro. I would prefer to play the formation we did today, the lineup we did today. I think it would be more effective playing against that press. And we saw it, I mean, both legs last year against Manchester City and then obviously against Ajax the year prior. As you mentioned, Kiyan, we struggled so much, and Casemiro specifically struggled so much. And it's always a pros cons with Casemiro, and more often than not, far often than not, his pros outweigh the cons. But I think in those types of games, it's probably better to play a more press-resistant side and play with Kroos and Modric as your base, and then have kind of, as we talked about, Mendy interchanging, Lucas Vazquez interchanging, just a fluid movement of players that are comfortable on the ball, comfortable dealing with that press. And so I know it's probably in Zidane's head, it's almost sacrilegious to even think about because he loves Casemiro, but this definitely has to kind of get him thinking, at least, because the team played phenomenally well against a side that's known for obviously their man-to-man press, and that's what they're known for. So it's definitely worthwhile thinking about.
This is the perennial question with Casemiro we've been having since 15-16 when I brought it up, and it was sacrilegious to talk about this then, but I think it's a little less controversial now. I think people understand the pros and cons of him, and because someone's going to jump on it anyway, like, over the long run, Casemiro needs to be the defensive midfielder. We need a defensive midfielder in the squad. But we have a good track record of in big games. We can't play Casemiro, of Kroos, Modric, and whoever the third central midfielder is stepping up, right? So you have the Clásico in 16-17, where it was a Modric, Kovacic double pivot, I think, versus Manchester City in 15-16 in the second leg. Kroos was playing as the lone single defensive midfielder. And then, and just in terms of this game, it just wouldn't have been really possible, I think, to do those positional rotations with Casemiro on the side. So, I mean, if he was playing, he would have been in the semi-double pivot with Kroos, and Modric would have been trying to play that Valverde role, like alternating between the right wing and the right half space. And it just would have been a lot harder to build out from the back from there. Because if Casemiro was playing, right, Modric, because I said actually wrongly, he would be trying to straddle that right wing / right central midfielder role. He would have to come inside, right, and he would have to play in midfield, and then suddenly the imbalance on the right wing, which was already a little bit of an underload there because we didn't have a proper right winger. Lucas Vazquez was kind of playing by himself at times because, again, Vinicius moves over to the left, Mendy comes inside. The support for Lucas would have been a little iffy there, right? And that's just the thing with Casemiro is everyone recognizes that what he provides to the team is valuable and it's worth it. And that's why everyone adjusts around him in possession. But in particular edge cases, right, like versus Atalanta, versus City, versus Ajax, that working around him, it stops becoming worth it maybe a little bit, because press resistance becomes more important than anything. And in this case, what won us the game, in my opinion, was being able to manipulate the man-to-man press with that positional change, formation change. Just don't think it's really that possible with Casemiro on the side. And it's worth considering for specific games. I don't think anyone's questioning Casemiro's general place in the side, but when we're facing teams that high press, that dominate that way, and the key to winning the game is manipulating that press, I think you have to consider it. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's that much to say about it. We've discussed this often, but in this particular game, I think it is important to note that I just don't think those rotations work that well if Casemiro is playing, and we'd have to look to defeat the press in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Sorry, Matt, just really quickly. I think it's interesting also, like, you know, maybe like out of all the figures who played in the midfield today, Fede Valverde maybe on the surface is the one that you would say is equipped to take on that Casemiro mantle. But ultimately, I did think it was going to be Modric anyway, because Fede, as a lone anchor, we still really haven't seen that. And I'm not sure if it would work. Like, we had this idea of like Kovacic back in the day could take that role as the pivot, as a single pivot. And that never really worked. Like, Kovacic and double pivot worked, but not really as an anchor. It got ripped apart by Bayern. But a double pivot works. I think it's the same idea with Fede Valverde. But ultimately, like, if you had to choose who goes in double pivot between Modric and Fede, it kind of has to be Modric, because he's a little bit better at just dropping deep, kind of connecting the dots from defense to midfield, but also covering for the wing back. And Fede can play a little bit higher up the pitch on the right wing or wherever, you know what I mean? So it is interesting. And Fede in this game was, out of the three, Fede, Kroos, and Modric was the least visible. But that doesn't mean he had a bad game, but it just, like, his influence wasn't as great as the other two. And we can talk about Fede's performance a little bit later in the podcast. I thought he was fine. But yeah, Matt, what did you want to say about this whole Casemiro thing?
I was just kind of laughing to myself because over the weekend, the post-game pod was, we need to just play. If we're going to play like this, let's play to Casemiro's strengths and use him as the number 10, the striker or whatever. And then now midweek, the narrative completely changes and we're like, we're so much better without Casemiro. 3-5-2. This is the way to play against press resistance. So it's just funny how quickly things in the narrative can change. But on Fede, I do want to touch on Fede as well, because you brought him up there. I don't think playing him in that, especially the lone pivot role, I think that curtails too much of what he brings to the game. Like, he's high energy, high pace, get you up the field quickly. His ability to get up the field and progress possession is so underrated. And I think if you play him in a more disciplined role, it kind of takes that out. It takes that away from him. And so he'll become half the player he is. So I really don't see him in that lone pivot role. I know we've tried it before, but I don't see a future for him there. But today it was interesting. Eduardo tweeted out that, like, the team looks a lot like has a lot more energy, a lot more freshness with Vinicius and Fede in there. And although both of them, especially Fede, were more peripheral figures in the first half, I thought that was true. Like, you saw, they just gave you an injection of pace, an injection of life, a little bit of a spark when they got on the ball, and they both can progress you up the field so quickly. So I do think they add a totally different dynamic to the team when they both play.